Diesel is on the way out. And yeah, we've been hearing this for literal years, even as the automakers continue to produce current model year cars with diesel engines. We still have the Chevrolet Silverado, the Ford F-Series, the GMC Sierra, the Ram 3500, the Mercedes Sprinter, and even the Cadillac Escalade. And that's just to name a few. However, while it's true that diesel-powered cars are still being produced in 2025 and are likely to still be manufactured into the 2030s, there appears to be a change in attitude within the automotive industry, to where even the executives seem to be acknowledging that the clock is ticking. And look, this is about more than just an engine and a fuel source, but about the slow death of the diesel, whose story goes back over a century. Rudolf Diesel patented the compression ignition engine in 1892, and by the 1920s, Cummins was using their Model U diesel engine to power a journey from New York City to Los Angeles that was achieved in a record-breaking 97 hours. And in the century since, diesel has not only become one of the driving forces of Denny's parking lots across the country, but one of the key symbols of vocational utility in our society. From farm equipment to school buses to freights and even our military. And that's not only in American society, no. The diesel is part of worldwide car culture. Yet, according to one Toyota executive, diesel just might be at the tail end of its life, and a move towards hydrogen may be the way forward. Yeah, I don't know about that, but I'm open to having my mind changed. Is hydrogen truly a viable alternative? Could diesel really be swapped out in favor of fuel cells? And are diesels actually knocking at death's door in the first place? Or is this a ludicrous overreaction?
Roman report at the end of the month, and I make what I want when I feel like discussing cars.
Toyota Australia Sales and Marketing Vice President Sean Hanley was interviewed by The Drive Australia, and he expressed his belief that diesel could be phased out long-term down the line, as hydrogen becomes established as an alternative. Quote, "Eventually I think diesel, not in the foreseeable future, but in the longer term. I can't imagine diesel necessarily being a fuel source of the future, because the reality is that petrol will do everything it can do, plus some. I think over time, diesel's not going to go anytime in the next decade, but beyond that, I think hydrogen will take over diesel eventually. That's what I think." End quote. It's a very hedging prediction, but that's all you can really do in the auto industry. I mean, I could say that Toyota will bring back the MR2 at some point in the next 15 years, but that has about as much meaning as a middle school relationship. And by the same token, you can say hydrogen will take over eventually. But I would argue that eventually has a different meaning in an industry where 10 or 15 years can contain the kinds of enormous changes we've seen in the automotive industry. Like the rise of Tesla, the decline of Tesla, the inescapable permanence of Tesla, the eradication of affordable sedans and used cars because Cash for Clunkers nuked them all like a lone wanderer on a villain playthrough. There's the gradual death of the manual transmission, squeezing the joy out of automotive enthusiasts faster than a 2-mile construction zone. There's the increase in EV infrastructure, the resurgence of hybrids, and the life-shortening realization that the first-gen Prius is now old enough to qualify as a classic car. Ugh, why am I getting so heated about this? Medication. Basically, the auto industry shifts like it's wearing caps lock as a hat, which begs the question, why does it matter what one executive of Toyota's Australian wing thinks about the future of diesel. Well, Australia is a country uniquely qualified to speak on the advantages of the diesel engine, because in Australia, diesel is basically part of a balanced breakfast. It's one of the diesel engine's best markets, and in trying to research why, I mostly came across the usual explanations like how it's a more concentrated energy source that's more fuel efficient than petrol, offers better low-end torque, doesn't need distributors or spark plugs, and withstands higher compression ratios. But one interesting theory I've seen suggested is that diesel engines became popular because they were the most capable of withstanding Australia's historically poor fuel quality. And while I'm not sure if I entirely believe that, it probably makes as much sense as any other outlandish theory, like diesel becoming popular only because Vegemite isn't a sustainable fuel source. But Hanley's opinion as an Australian automotive executive is valuable, because in this scenario, Australia is the canary in the coal mine. If there ever comes a time where diesel-powered vehicles are no longer viable in Australia, then trust that they've already been discontinued everywhere else. But then that leads us to another question. Is diesel actually on the decline? Well, an article by Autoblog found that in Australia, quote, half of Toyota's sales are diesels, with stalwarts like the Land Cruiser seeing demand surge nearly 690% in 2025, even as prices creep higher. End quote. But in Europe, electric car sales have actually overtaken diesel for the last 2 years, with new registrations reportedly falling by 11.4% across the continent, bringing it down to 1.27 million vehicles registered overall, which comes out to an 11.8% decline from 2023 when you include figures from the UK and the European Free Trade Association. Meanwhile, in the US, over a 5-year period between 2017 and 2022, diesel car sales suffered a 76% decrease from 6.8 million units per year to just 1.6 million units. It's a shocking fall-off when you consider how vital the diesel has been to car culture. I mean, Mercedes made their bones on diesel passenger cars, on turbo diesel luxury passenger cars, stuff created specifically to meet US CAFE standards. But now, Mercedes doesn't even make diesel passenger cars for the US market anymore. We're left with memories of W123s and W124s and the like. We're left to remember the Volkswagen Golfs back before Volkswagen destroyed the diesel's long-term credibility by trying to cheat like a groom on the night before his wedding. And let's make the argument that, okay, maybe it was all for the better, as diesel may have been good in some instances, but was disastrous in many others. I've read enough horror stories about clogged fuel systems and busted injectors, and engines that knock like a surprise visit from the in-laws, and oh look, they brought luggage with them, ugh. And that's before even getting into the pollution and the impact that diesel engines have on the environment, to say nothing of what they do to the public health, and we'll get to that eventually. But even if we make that argument, how does this mean that hydrogen is the answer? Where does hydrogen come into the equation? Well, the type of hydrogen that the auto industry needs is green hydrogen. And let's break down the hydrogen rainbow real quick, because you see, while hydrogen itself is colorless, scientists use colors to classify them by their carbon output. And out of all the various colors, green hydrogen is the only climate-neutral variant. Gray hydrogen is the product of methane gas, black hydrogen uses black coal, Brown hydrogen uses brown coal, and while there are other colors, let's just say they're all less sustainable than green. Now, while fuel cell electric vehicles are less energy efficient than their battery electric counterparts, they're more energy efficient than gasoline. But while green hydrogen is a clean energy source, it's more expensive right now than its fossil fuel brothers, although it's likely to get less expensive over time as it becomes more prevalent and prolific. And so it makes sense that an automaker would want to apply this to their business model. An automaker like Toyota. Yet, while they're far from the only automaker with hydrogen in mind, the idea that hydrogen could be a viable path forward has been a long gestating idea for Toyota, and they've put it into practice with vehicles like the Mirai. In fact, they've been at this since at least 2015, when they began touring a fuel cell electric vehicle all across Australia. They even went as far as to build mobile refueling stations to show that with the right infrastructure, cars like the Mirai could be the future of the automotive industry, such that diesel would largely become a redundant energy source. And at a distance, it does seem like a decent idea, if for no other reason than the good it would do the environment to have a fuel source whose only output is water and heat. But then, my dance moves at any wedding reception on the eastern seaboard produce water and heat too, and you don't see me getting billion-dollar investments for it. Yet. Now, Toyota is going to have to do more to get this off the ground, naturally. Producing a hydrogen combustion version of the Hi-Ace van is one thing. Implementing hydrogen and fuel cell EVs at a global level, when infrastructure isn't even entirely in place for battery electric vehicles, is a bigger uphill battle than going on a diet the week of Thanksgiving. But Hanley recognizes this, telling the Drive that it's going to take time for things like infrastructure and sourcing green hydrogen. It's not going to be an overnight thing, but it's a path to which Toyota remains committed, particularly in the wake of the European Union passing a motion in 2022 to have internal combustion vehicles phased out entirely by 2035, coupled with multiple automakers making similar pledges to fully electrify their lineups within the next decade. Hanley states, quote, "We're very much invested in hydrogen. Nothing's changed, but it's not a short-term investment. So I don't want people to think that hydrogen is suddenly going to be taking off between now and 2030. Particularly that 2035 horizon, I truly believe hydrogen will be our future. And that's where I think you might see a change of diesel technology at that point. Why? Hydrogen is clean. Hydrogen infrastructure will be significantly better than what you have today, so it will be more convenient and it'll be affordable." End quote. And that right there is how hydrogen takes over, by ultimately being more affordable. Ignoring hurdles like infrastructure for a moment, I truly believe people are more likely to overlook the unfamiliarity of a fuel cell EV if it ends up costing them less money over the life of the car. Even in Australia, which seems to be the exception rather than the rule when it comes to diesel's popularity, which isn't to say diesel doesn't still have a share in the market in other territories, but rather that it's diminished considerably. When we look at the 10-year difference, automakers offered more than 200 different diesel options in 2015 in the UK alone. 10 years later, that number has declined by 68%, with roughly 65 diesel variants available as of 2024. And it's even worse in the US, as only 5 brands are still producing diesel vehicles that you can buy domestically: Chevrolet, GMC, Ford, Mercedes-Benz, and Ram. They're just not as prevalent in passenger vehicles as they used to be, and I would argue that part of it is the stigma that developed around them. That reputation for being these big, slow, dirty vehicles that make a bunch of noise and pollute the air everywhere they go. Respect for diesel-powered vehicles got chipped away, even as society still holds sacred the noble work of the blue collars who operate them. You know, depending on where you live, I guess. Volkswagen has tried to alter public perception with their TDI Truth or Dare campaign, but when you have Volkswagen banging the drum for diesel, you might as well call it a day. The Dieselgate emissions cheating scandal hurt the perception of diesel in ways that Volkswagen would be hard-pressed to ever atone for. And it's fitting to talk about this now, on the 10-year anniversary of the scandal kicking off in September 2015. Because it was bad enough that the US Environmental Protection Agency called Volkswagen into the principal's office for violating the Clean Air Act, but it was significantly worse once the news broke that the reason was because they were using defeat devices on their diesel-powered cars that let them cheat emissions. And the cherry on top of this carcinogenic sundae were the studies that theorized the pollution may have shortened lives. A 2025 study by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, conducted on behalf of environmental law group Client Earth, estimates that the emissions caused by the Dieselgate scandal were responsible for 16,000 deaths in the UK, 30,000 cases of asthma in children, and has the potential to cause an additional 6,000 deaths if no action is taken to limit the pollution that diesel engines continue to cause. And while those numbers seem excessive, I would think they actually sound kind of low, considering how many Dieselgate cars were recalled in the UK when the scandal initially hit, around 1.2 million. It isn't really a surprise, then, that diesel would be a bit of a hard sell to your average Joe. You know, the one who doesn't really care about cars. And over the years, the perception of diesel has arguably gotten worse as automakers continue to struggle with regulating their own use of it. Look at Toyota! Seriously, look at Toyota, who got themselves mixed up in a little Dieselgate scandal of their own this year. In January, Toyota truck engine manufacturer Hino Motors pled guilty to fraud and criminal conspiracy for selling over 105,000 heavy-duty diesel-equipped vehicles in the United States between 2010 and 2022 that failed to meet emissions standards. As a result, they would have to pay a settlement of $1.6 billion. And the brutal irony of that legal judgment is that if they'd been able to get away with it for just a little while longer, they might not have ever had to answer for it, because the US government, used here as shorthand for the current administration, although I realize now that explaining it just makes this sentence longer and more awkward and clunky. So, the government is looking at policy rollbacks on vehicle emissions, and that means diesels might have just been thrown a lifeline. But the problem, as a diesel truck rolls by my window, the problem is that automakers have put so much into redeveloping their lineups to meet these emissions requirements that it might be too late or too expensive to turn back. On the one hand, Toyota's push towards hydrogen feels sort of like hedging their bets, but on the other hand, it also feels sort of necessary, you know, as a means of preparing for a potential fuel cell future. And yet, because there's always an and yet, you could easily argue that there are still more challenges facing hydrogen than can be outweighed by its benefits. For one, considering the inconsistency of electric vehicle infrastructure, it seems like an even more daunting task to try and implement hydrogen refueling infrastructure on top of it all. There's also the reality that these vehicles are likely to cost a lot, because I can't imagine there's a low-cost way to make them in the first place, at least not right now. The base price of the Toyota Mirai is around $51,795. That's base. while the Hyundai Nexo has a base price of $61,470. Hydrogen fuel tanks and fuel cell stack technology are as pricey as they are complex, and the costs are going to be passed down to the consumer. That's just how it's going to be, particularly in the early going, when automakers aren't in a position to produce these at anything other than low volumes. And honestly, there really isn't the demand for this yet, at least not at levels that would sustain high production volumes. And when you compare them to traditional EVs, they're not as energy efficient at cost. Research by Sergei Paltsev, a senior research scientist at the MIT Energy Initiative, found that, quote, the total cost of ownership for hydrogen was around 40% higher than a comparable gasoline vehicle, and about 10% more than an EV. End quote. Now, this is in addition to other market concerns, and there are other market concerns. For example, questions about how safe fuel cell vehicles are, because they can suffer from tank ruptures in the event of high pressure buildups, and there's the risk of electric shocks, and the overall flammability of hydrogen gas. There are also worries about maintenance costs due to the high levels of specialization that will be required to work on these vehicles. However, you could argue that each one of these points could easily be applied to EVs, yet they've become a way of life already, and in relatively short order. And hydrogen may actually offer more than an EV in some cases, like better range, shorter refueling times, and a long-term outlook that suggests they could become cheaper than battery EVs, since BEVs rely on materials that are mined in countries where those materials aren't always in great supply, to say nothing of the geopolitical situation in some of these places. But ultimately, it might be hard for the car community to truly let go, because diesel is more than just a fuel or an engine option on a classic car, or the thing that powers that heavy-duty pickup truck. For some, it represents the tractor whose operation helps sustain the family farm. It's the sound of a school bus rounding the corner. It's the memory of that cross-country haul. And in some cases, it represents dependability, a stable thing in unstable times. That's a feeling that hydrogen would have a hard time replicating, much less replacing entirely. Yet, electric vehicles faced the same challenges, and they've seen more and more people adopting them as the years roll on, to where it doesn't seem like EVs are this alien threat that needs to be resisted. Diesel might have many more years left, even if many more only boils down to 10 or 15 years. But the slow death of the diesel is a natural byproduct of an evolving automotive industry. So do I believe that diesel is on the way out? Yeah, I do. I do believe that diesel is on the way out. But I do think it'll take longer than Hanley predicts it will. And I say this despite knowing significantly less about the interior parameters of the automotive industry than Hanley does. But for me, I just don't see how hydrogen takes the place when people are already reticent about EVs, even if that hesitation has thinned out over the years. Like, we can't get the overall public this close to accepting EVs, and then now we're going to introduce this other new thing that weirds them out. But then maybe that's kind of an atavistic mindset where I'm not really thinking about the implications for the future and how much better this could potentially be. Maybe I'm not seeing the full picture here. I'm not seeing the vision. And maybe in 20, 25 years, if I'm lucky enough to still be here, knocking around on this blue and green and brown orb, maybe I'll witness firsthand that fuel cell electric vehicles not only make sense, but were the right choice all along. Maybe. I don't know. Who's to say in 25 years? I mean, 25 years ago, I was in my room reading an old copy of Electronics Gaming Monthly, scouring the pages for any word of the next Final Fantasy game. And now I have a pocket communicator that I can use to do all that scanning for me. I think when it's all said and done, the question is not whether batteries or fuel cells will eventually replace diesel, but whether or not the public will be truly ready to move on from engines that once defined car culture and the vocational operation of society. But hey, what do you think? Is hydrogen the future? Is diesel on the way out? Would you consider a hydrogen car if you had the chance? Let me know what you think in the comments, and keep an eye out for my screen name, Limited Time Roman. I'll be in there chatting. If RCR brings any value to your week whatsoever, please leave us a like, subscribe, and treat that bell icon like a hydrogen atom slamming into an oxygen atom. But if you want to support us in the biggest possible way, please consider joining our Patreon for just $1 to unlock a bunch of additional videos. And check out my latest RCR story. It's my favorite thing I've ever made for RCR. It's the story of the impossible race across the world, from New York to Paris in 1908. I've linked it in the description. I guarantee you'll enjoy it. I never gas myself up about anything, but I feel like this video is actually really good by my standards. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your week.